the chairperson and the CEO had allegedly tried to force her to conduct an unscheduled interview with the ANC's President Cyril Ramaphosa ahead of the local government elections last year. The South African Weather Service says heavy rainfall is expected this weekend over some parts of Gauteng and the northwest. It may lead to flooding. Gauteng temperatures are expected to peak at 12 degrees tomorrow and 11 degrees on Sunday. The northwest province can expect temperatures of 14 and 16 degrees over the weekend. Senior forecaster Jacqueline Mudipa.
As of later this evening, we do have potential for some disruptive rain that might lead to some localized flooding of susceptible areas, especially low-lying areas, and that will be later this evening into the early hours of tomorrow.
To identify certain body parts in indigenous South African languages if they could not produce their ID or a passport. Scores of disgruntled community members have been protesting in the township since Tuesday over the increase in crime in the area. The EFF's Nawo Tambo.
We must condemn collectively the South African Police Services, who we saw this morning doing door-to-door raids in Diepsloot, and when a person cannot provide a passport, they ask them to explain what an elbow is in Xitsonga. This is what led to the murder of our people in Boipatong in the early 90s. If you couldn't say Ndololwane, you get killed. Now if you can't say elbow in Xitsonga, they arrest you. The police are perpetuating the criminalization of our people based on how they look, based on the texture of their hair, based on the color of their skin in terms of darkness, and based on their dialect. And it must be condemned. The police must not sink to the level of vigilante groups simply to please them.
The Western Cape Education Department says learners and staff at Primrose Park Primary in Menenberg are receiving counselling following the murder of a staff member. The 61-year-old woman was shot and killed just after 7 this morning in Gunene Street. She had been at the school for more than 20 years. Police say the motive for the attack is not known at this stage. Spokesperson for the Western Cape Education Department, Brona Hammond.
Our sincere condolences go out to the family and friends and school community of Primrose Park Primary after the sad loss of one of their staff members this morning. The staff member was shot and killed on her way to school this morning. The WCD has arranged for counselling support for learners and staff. The motive of the shooting is unknown. The incident happened while travelling to school and not within the school property, which has been incorrectly reported.
And Britain says it will send Ukraine a further 2 billion rands worth of military support amid concerns Russia is preparing for a major new offensive in the east. Invading Russian troops have retreated from around Kyiv after meeting stiff resistance from Ukrainian troops. Kyiv has accused Moscow of attacking, killing and raping civilians in towns around the capital during its month-long occupation of the areas. Russia has denied the allegations. A recap of the top story. The SABC says the report of the Special Committee into Allegations by former head of news Patisa Makopeni has recommended that employees and board members be cautioned about sensitivities around editorial independence at the public broadcaster. The board has adopted the report, which found allegations by Makopeni against board chair Bongumusa Makatini to be unfounded. For SAFM News, I am Amanda Machaga. More news at 7.
Oliver Dickson on SAFM.
Here, there, and everywhere. SAFM 105.1 FM in Johannesburg.
Freedom. What does it mean? How do we feel it? How do we act it out? We have the right to think and to speak. We are not being subjected to slavery. We are free.
In South Africa,
Happy Freedom Month with us here on SAFM.
SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365, Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za.
We must act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building.
Mandela's legacy is carried by us as a united people. Let us stand together, because together we can overcome. We have done it before, and we can certainly do it again. Hashtag we will overcome. SAFM, leading our united nation in this conversation. This week, today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
And it is exactly 7 minutes after 6 p.m. You are listening to the Friday edition of This Week Today. While it's only on Fridays, my name is Oliver Dickson, and I'm happy to be back in your company. I'm honored, in fact, to be back in your company as we take a look at the biggest stories of this week and do a deep dive into the issues that matter and ask the question, what does all of this mean? What does any of this mean, really? And why is it of any significance and importance to you? Coming up on the show today, in the second half of the show, we're going to take a look at the ethnic war that's happening in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, where the Tigrayan civilians over there are being massacred. 5 million people today at risk of dying due to famine because aid is unable to reach them. It's a terrible, terrible situation. To date, more than 200,000 people have died, and this war only started in November of 2020. So in less than 2 years, effectively, more than 200,000 people have died at a daily toll of more than 100 people being killed. And these 5 million people who are at risk of dying of famine are invisible to the world. Tonight, we shed visibility on their lives and ask the question, how can we help? What's the international community to do? But in the first half of the show, we're having an equally as critical conversation. The health regulations for what is to be dubbed the Health Act is out for public comment on COVID-19 regulations. As you guys know, we are no longer under a state of national disaster. The regulations that governed our lives really under the state of national disaster will now be replaced by a document called the Health Act. That document is out for public comment, and a draft bill of sorts is out, and anyone can comment on that. More than 80,000 comments have been recorded to date. That's a lot. I've never seen South Africans being that proactive about any sort of legislation, and that's exciting to see that we're a politically engaged country in shaping our democracy going forward. The bulk of those comments aren't too positive. In fact, many of those comments point out the draconian nature of the restrictions that could potentially govern our lives going forward. And a lot of people asking the question, where's the shift of power going to? Is this a new paradigm of governance that subverts parliamentary rule? In fact, because parliament creates the laws that govern our lives, the oversight duty of these laws rests in parliament. But how much power is this shifting to the executive? How much power will the executive be able to use unfettered and unregulated, in the sense that it cannot and almost will never be held to the same level of accountability outside of the parliamentary structure? And so a lot of people asking questions about that. But the fundamental question for me is, what does the right framework look like for us to deal with the epidemiological threat of COVID-19 going forward? That's the fundamental question. What's the best possible model for doing that? That's what's coming up on the show. And my first guest for that is Dr. Nicholas Crisp, who's the head of the National Vaccination Program in the Department of Health. Again, the show is live on YouTube. So if you're streaming and listening to us from YouTube, thank you so much for tuning in. Really, really do appreciate it. But across the rest of the country, it is between 104 and 107 FM. You can tweet us at SAFM Radio. That's on Twitter. That's also on Facebook as well as on Instagram. Or you can tweet me directly. It is at Oliver_speaking on Twitter. It's Oliver Dickson on Facebook. We do look forward to reading some of your SMSs later on in the show. It is 41391. There you can SMS us on that particular line. And we will be able to read your SMSs, or you can send us voice notes on the WhatsApp line and we will be able to listen to them. But keep those voice notes under a minute long. If it's over a minute, we're definitely not going to listen to it. So keep it under a minute and we'll be able to engage some of those voice notes later on in the show. But right now, we're going to our first conversation with Dr. Nicholas Crisp.
SAFM, setting the nationwide agenda daily.
Oliver Dickson on SAFM.
Dr. Nicholas Crisp, thank you so much for your time and welcome to This Week Today. Really pleasure, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you on the program. Before we get to the big question around what the right framework is to deal with our epidemiological threat of COVID-19 and any other such contagion that might come about in the future, the first question I want to ask you is, have we given up on vaccinating people?
And good evening to all the listeners. It's a pleasure to talk to you. No, we've definitely not given up on vaccinating people.
It sure seems like it.
We are just... No. We have the capability to vaccinate 250,000 people every day. Health workers are out there working hard every day. The public have given up on us. People don't seem to understand that there's still a threat out there. They don't seem to understand that there's still a lot of COVID. They don't seem to understand that it's really lousy getting in hospital and getting sick and having long COVID and having your family and members dying. And there's a narrative out there that says that if you've had COVID and you think you've got immunity, you don't need to be vaccinated. And that's wrong. We are very capable and very willing and wanting to vaccinate people. And we implore you, there's a boomer vaccination weekend this weekend that started today. We are vaccinating undocumented people across the country as well. We're vaccinating anybody and everybody who will come. So please, by all means, we are ready for you.
Why is it that people are not turning up? I don't imagine that the public would just give up on their right to life and health, right? Is the government not efficiently communicate the need for a vaccination? Because I think there was a communication crisis at one point, right? And overcoming that misinformation of 2020 was incredibly hard. I don't take that for granted for a second, right? But it doesn't seem much effort was steered towards overcoming that misinformation pandemic, really, in and of itself, to be able to convince people that vaccination is the right thing to do.
Well, Oliver, how does one go about this? So we've had 120 radio stations in all the 11 national vernacular plus 3 other languages, written media. We've got the Kiredi campaign running at the moment where the youth are running the campaign. We've had traditional leaders, church leaders, parliamentarians, politicians, all kinds of people out there selling the message. I must have done 200 to 250 different radio and TV interviews over the last 10 months since I've been running this program. And there have been science experts and all kinds of manner of people. There's also social media campaigns that are out selling to people. Frankly, we're all tired. People are giving up. They are fed up. They don't want to wear masks. They don't want to listen to the government. Their lives have been messed up. And they seem to be under the impression that the risk is gone.
Yeah.
The state of disaster is gone. So why should I bother?
Yeah, it's despite that COVID fatigue that we all have, it really is encouraging to see that 80,000 people have put their voices to paper in terms of the COVID regulations going forward. The majority of them obviously not happy. Before we get to the question around why those people aren't happy, let's talk about what is needed for the country going forward to deal with the epidemiological threat of COVID-19. What should our future look like, given the potential that there may be one or other variant coming up, and that variant may be highly transmissible, maybe deadlier than any other variant we've had possibly, and we do not have a state of national disaster with various levels to fall back on to be able to deal with it almost immediately, right? What then should the framework look like going forward?
So ideally, we shouldn't need all these laws at all. We should have law-abiding citizens who understand and have sufficient information to enable them to make the right choices. But society doesn't work like that, and we do have a regulated society. And I heard your introduction, so let's try and clarify some of the points of what is on the table and what's not.
Sure.
First of all, we operated under, prior to the end of apartheid, we operated under a piece of health legislation that was from 1977. That was replaced by a new Health Act in 2003. That's the Health Act that we function under the moment. And in Section 90 of that Act, which is an Act of Parliament, there's provision for the minister to make regulations, a whole string of matters on which the minister can make regulations. So we're not talking about a new Health Act. We do not need to amend the Health Act for this particular purpose. We'll do that when we get to national health insurance, not for this purpose. So for this purpose, what we need is to make sure that the existing regulations are satisfactory to be able to use if we need them to control whatever the threats are to our social fabric from a health perspective. Now, most of the issues that people have complained about have been in the law since 1977. They have not changed. So, for instance, the clause that allows the health department to get a court order to have someone admitted to a facility has been in place since 1977. And it's still in place in the law. It's not a new piece of legislation. But there are other issues that have been raised. And congratulations to South Africans. It's way over 200,000 comments now, not just the 80 that you've been made aware of. And it's quite a big job for us to sort through all those comments. So we're happy about that. And we are happy that we will then use those comments to separate out the most essential changes that should be brought into the regulations. We're not talking about the Act. And that the minister will then republish regulations once we've considered all those comments. So we're not unhappy about those at all, and we will definitely be publishing something that looks different.
So shouldn't then the approach be to say, hey, here's what the regulations looked like before we had COVID. Here's what the Disaster Management Act allowed us and enabled us to do that was out of the ordinary. And here's what we will do that's brand new in terms of pre-COVID life going forward. And these are new regulations. We want you to comment only on these, not on pre-existing regulations that governed our lives long before this disease came about. Because if we're going to spend our energy criticizing and critiquing a piece of legislation that's as old as the Department of Health, really, then we're not focusing our attention on the new sets of regulations that are critically important. Some of those really are that giving the Minister of Health, for instance, the power to advise cabinet on things that are outside of health-related matters. Things like, can we shut down the country? Things like, can we close the borders? Should we prohibit the sale and distribution of alcohol? Should we have a national curfew in place? That's not something I think the health minister, at least personally for me, and this is obviously a normative point I'm making, right, and it's up for debate. But those aren't things I think, Dr. Crisp, that the health minister should be able to advise on. I think there are people better suited within our state infrastructure to make those sort of, to offer at least that level of advice.
So some of those things you've mentioned, Oliver, are not in the draft regulations, and they're not in the existing control. We have international treaties we are signatory to throughout the world that, for instance, regulates how we manage people movement in respect of yellow fever, malaria, etc. So we apply those, and we use the regulations now in Port Health to regulate that. So that is not what's up for debate. What is up for debate is some of the conditions that would be specific to, can we now insist that somebody must have a vaccination to cross the border to come into our country, or require them to have a test? So that is a requirement for yellow fever. If you try to come into South Africa, having been in equatorial Africa or in the East, in Asia, you will not be allowed to come into the border without vaccinating or proving you've already been vaccinated for yellow fever. Now we are trying to do the same thing for COVID to protect us all from the possibility of other infections and variants from outside of the country. It's not something new. This is a global thing that's been in place before. The question is around the new things. Should the minister have the right to tell us to wear masks in public spaces? Right now, that is a regulation that is under the 30-day period on the outside of the Disaster Management Act, because there was no previous regulation that allowed the minister to do that.
Yeah.
So the question to the public is, should the Minister of Health be allowed to regulate when and where we should wear masks to protect us from slobbering over one another in the event that there's a respiratory virus doing the rounds? And if the public feel that they are sufficiently informed that that they want to comment that we shouldn't be allowing the minister to decide when that is necessary, that is the comment we will look at. But there are some of these measures that the public has commented on in a nice, constructive and positive way, where I think we must listen and we must see, like, should we be doing PCRs on children between the age of 5 and 12? That's a moot point. They are not allowed to be vaccinated because we don't have a vaccine for that age group. So should we be forcing them to do PCR tests? And people have raised that with us, and it's something we will be considering. So those are just some of the examples of really useful comments that people are making to us.
I like the yellow fever example, because a common criticism really is also the fact that, well, these regulations aren't just about dealing with COVID-19. It seems to be a piece of legislation that's to deal with all communicable diseases, and the argument there is that government's overextending its hand. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, Oliver, look, I think there's always one has to listen. People perceive things, and and we need to listen to them. So I think that one of the very useful comments that has come out so far that we've seen and heard in the public space is separate the regulations. Don't try and do everything all at once. If you want to have specific COVID control measures in the regulations of the Health Act, then specify that they are for COVID and don't try and mix everything.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's pretty sage advice, and we will look at that.
Sure.
There are other issues around other diseases which we need to prepare for now, because who knows, this is not likely to be the last epidemic. We've had cholera, we've had typhoid, we've had all kinds of things lately. And are our regulations, based on what we've learned during COVID, satisfactory to deal with other threats should they arise? Or should we wait until the
would have been for the Department of Health to function under a National Health Insurance Act. Where are we standing on that? Is COVID, our response to COVID and the impact of COVID must have brought about new realities around our healthcare system, its ability and durability to deal with vast healthcare matters. It's been thoroughly stress tested. And people are asking whether or not the National Health Insurance Act still has a place in our future as a paradigm through which we can deal with health-related matters. What's the question top of mind for you in relation to that when you look at what COVID has done to us and you think about the National Health Insurance Act? Do you think there's still a possibility of this being carried out successfully? Yeah. Crisp, is about the capability to carry it out, right? And I think there's sufficient reason to believe that reformation need to look like the National Health Insurance Act. Could it look like something else? And that's up for debate, right? And that's why it goes through the legislative process of Parliament, National Council of Provinces, and all the more. But the question is the capability to carry it out. I mean, if we couldn't even get hospitals, field hospitals up and running sufficiently in time to respond to the threat of a new wave, if we couldn't even prevent, for instance, corruption and fraud in PPE procurement, a lot of people are asking, how will we cope with rolling out Health Insurance Act to its original intent? I like that you mentioned public-private partnerships in dealing with COVID, right? And sharing data. Yet we're struggling to get a national patient registry up. Where patient files don't get lost in hospitals and can be shared amongst hospitals and amongst provinces with ease. It surely seems like we have a real capacity issue in South Africa, and we can't really, and realistically speaking, can't rely on the private sector alone to be able to fill those gaps.
No, on the contrary, we have more capabilities than we give ourselves credit for. In this together, and that everybody's life matters, and that until the last person is healthy, none of us is truly healthy. We need to have a healthy workforce, a healthy school force going to school. We need to get proper healthcare for everybody, and you've got to make sure that healthcare is available without putting people into financial hardship. We already have the electronic vaccine delivery system. Everybody said we wouldn't get it in place. With no extra budget and based on the National Health Insurance System's digital platform, we were able to build it while we were flying this plane called COVID. We were able to do it together with the private partners and with the capability in the public sector. We can do these things, but we do have the scourge called corruption. Last year, or the year before, the private sector reported over 11 billion fraud just in the private sector. So we all have this problem, and we have to fix it. Look, there's no question about it. We are not happy about it, and it will continue to disrupt and undermine everything that we are trying to do. But can we create a new service? Yes, we can. Were we ever challenged that we would never create the new South Africa? Well, we did. And we made some good things, and we have made some mistakes along the way, but we did it. That
sounds ideologically optimistic, and I absolutely love your optimism. You're right. We need an attitude change, and that positive attitude is exactly that. We do not have the capacity for some of the things we hope for. So let's speak about capacity. What did we learn? And I, be as honest as you possibly can. No one's going to fire you, Dr. Crisp. What did you learn about the capacity of us to deal with certain issues during COVID that you may fear that we do not have the capacity to, to roll out some of the National Health Insurance Act, hopeful goals that we have? We cannot pretend like we have more capacity than we do when, Dr. Ramahima Musa Hospital still didn't have water last year, when Saleh Maklek has not yet completed building some of those things. There's a real capacity issue, and we can't ignore that.
Yeah, but we also have remarkable hospitals such as Bethel Hospital in Mpumalanga that nobody even knows that it's one of the most beautiful hospitals you've ever seen. It's a public sector hospital. So we do have serious challenges in some hospitals, and we have the most magnificent services. Remember that.
What are some of those key serious challenges for you? Highlight some of those for us.
Yeah, sure. So we have, first of all, a budget that is too small for the services that we provide. We have to provide huge numbers of patients with healthcare where we are only getting half of what we spend in the country. So the vast majority of people go to the public service, and we are slowly but surely cramming out the ability to continue to provide services. We don't have the money in the budget to employ the numbers of people we need to care for them. 2/3 of the specialists of the country are working in the private sector. That leaves 1/3 to look after the majority of the population. Those same people are the people who trained me and trained every other doctor in this country. Our academics are heroes. They are people who are looking after not just the patients with the most complicated problems in the country, but they're trying to train the next generation. We have nurses who are fed up there, and we complain about their attitudes. But they get treated badly by the patients. Their lives are threatened. They get attacked in the wards. We've had nurses who have been raped in the hospitals as well. We need a society to recognize that we are also human as healthcare workers. Healthcare workers have worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they have not really been recognized and appreciated for the work they do. We have emergency medical personnel who are attacked when they're out on an ambulance trip to go and collect patients. Really, this is very demoralizing in the public service. We also don't control our budget for capital works. That is in the public workspace, and it's something we need to relook at how we do it. We don't have vast amounts of money for fixing very old facilities. So we could give you the litany of all the challenges that we have in the department. But notwithstanding that, these heroic healthcare workers see millions of our countrymen every day looking after them as best as they possibly can. And if they don't have enough beds and there's problems and challenges around the place, it's not all due to corruption. It's not all due to theft.
Some of it is due to competency. Let's speak about competency. Do we have competent hospital CEOs across the board, not just one or two hospitals? Because we're not going to play whataboutism like, this hospital is bad, but what about this great hospital? Across the board, do we have that capability?
Look, the vast majority of hospitals, we do have very capable management looking after them. There are managers who are struggling. There are many people who are acting in positions where we struggle to fill, particularly the senior positions, and to get competitive salaries for really competent people to run hospitals. I mean, there's no secret about that. But do we have really good hospitals with really good managers? We do. And we should be proud of them because they really do a good job. They're not always listened to, and we do get interference. We get the public interfere. We get sometimes political interference in the process, and it is frustrating for managers. So, I am coming up for my colleagues. I've been back in the government now for 10 months, having worked all over Africa for many, many years, and we don't give ourselves credit for all the amazing things that we do. We need to start appreciating ourselves as South Africans and knuckle down together, get in the bull ring and fix these things that don't work for us.
Still love your optimism. Final question from me, Dr. Crisp. What's the magic number? How much do we need?
So what we need is what we've got at the moment. 8.5% of our GDP is enough. The problem in this country is inequity. We don't distribute it properly. So we have people on whom we spend anything and everything and who earn a fortune, and a small number of people who earn the vast majority of all the money in the country. We know that 80% of the wealth in the country is held by 10% of the population. And that doesn't work for us anymore. And that applies to health as well. We have to take the resources we got and save the waste, stop the duplication, stop the fraud and corruption at every possible turn we can, and start using every cent, turn it over and use it wisely, properly to look after patient care and not frivolous things in our systems.
Dr. Nicholas Crisp, really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us here on This Week Today.
Thanks, Oliver.
And that was Dr. Nicholas Crisp, the head of the vaccination program in the Department of Health, who's also responsible for seeing out the National Health Insurance Act. And it's going to be an interesting couple of months in our parliamentary system, going through the relevant legislative processes to be able to bring this document to life. And we also reflected very deeply there on the Health Act that will govern our lives in dealing with contagions and epidemiological threats going forward. On the other side of this, we speak about what's happening in Ethiopia. Stay tuned.
This Week Today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m. The SABC News Portal is your one-stop digital platform for all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest and breaking stories. Listen to all SABC radio stations live, including podcasts, and also watch the SABC News channel with clips and live streams of all the big news events. Simply download the SABC News app on your smartphone from the Play or App Store. SABC News, independent and impartial. If you're active on social media and love SAFM, we hope you'll take a moment to like or follow our SAFM page on Facebook and Twitter. These are the best places to find all the guest information, conversations, and stories you love from your favorite presenters, along with regular updates from SABC News. And don't forget, you can send your questions to feedback@safm.co.za. SAFM, leading the conversation.
SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za.
This week, today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
Welcome back to This Week Today. My name is Oliver Dickson, and I'm honored to be in your company again this Friday evening as we take a deep dive into the biggest issues of the week and ask the question, what does this all mean to you? Why is it of any importance and significance to your life? How does it shape your life going forward, and why should you care? Coming up on the second half of the show, we're going to speak about what's happening in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, where there's an ethnic cleansing war happening at the moment, right? And it's terrible. 5 million people are at risk of dying from starvation. More than 200,000 people to date have died in this war. That's a death toll of more than 100 people per day are being killed. Yet the world has been relatively silent if you compare that to the noise on what's happening in in the Ukraine. Yet the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia is far more bigger in death toll numbers and impact than that of what's happening in the Ukraine. It's a travesty that the world has not brought this to our attention with the same level of institutional debates that's been going on. The United Nations Security Council has called no special sitting on this the way they have called for emergency special conventions in terms of what's happening in Russia. There's been no special debates of recent, and yet 5 million people are at risk of dying. 5 million people. To put that into perspective for you, that's twice the amount of people that live in Botswana. That's how many people are at risk of dying. We're taking your comments. You can SMS us on 41391. That's our SMS line. Or you can send us a WhatsApp voice note on 061 4104 107. 061 4104 107. Keep those voice notes under a minute and we will be able to listen to it. If it's over a minute, we may not. Keep it short and crisp and tell us what you think, what some of your questions and thoughts and reflections are. Not just the conversation we're about to have, but the conversation we have already had. You can also stream this live on YouTube on the SAFM Radio YouTube channel where we are coming to you live as well. It's 104 and 107 across the country. My guest in this segment is Jean-Baptiste Galopin, who is a consultant with the crisis response at Amnesty International. And there's a very, very important and detailed report out from Amnesty International that we will speak about right now.
Oliver Dickson on SAFM.
Jean-Baptiste, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Let's start with the first question. What's actually happening in Ethiopia?
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me. So Ethiopia, as you probably know, has been at war since November 2020, when a conflict started pitting the federal government of Abiy Ahmed and its allies, including forces from the Amara region, which is next to Tigray, against the forces of the Tigrayan government, which is a region in the north of the country. And there's been reporting on this, but access has been limited for journalists and researchers, which means that the conflict, as you mentioned, hasn't received the attention that it should. As part of a project with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, we've documented that since the beginning of the conflict in November 2020, there's been a campaign of ethnic cleansing that was carried out by the forces of the Amhara region against the civilian population of Tigrayans in the area of Western Tigray, which is in the west of Tigray, all the way in the northwestern corner of Ethiopia, in the region that borders Eritrea and Sudan. And what we found was that the officials and the security forces of the Amhara region have carried out crimes against humanity and war crimes such as murder, arbitrary detention, mass arbitrary detention, sexual violence, pillage and looting, as well as the denial of humanitarian aid. So we're calling on the, we have a number of calls which we can discuss, but this is a really significant finding because hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced since the beginning of the conflict as a result of this campaign of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, let's speak about ethnic cleansing. What exactly is that?
So ethnic cleansing is not a formally defined crime in the international law, but it is an important concept. It's been used by UN panels of experts, by tribunals, and what it means is a purposeful policy by one group of displacing another group from a given territory through violent and terror-inspiring methods. So there's a number of components to this definition. One is the removal of a group from an area. The other is the methods, which are violent methods or terror-inspiring methods. And in the case of Western Tigray, we've seen this happen through very different ways. So first, during the initial offensive, when the government forces and the Amara forces took control of the area, there were many killings and looting, as well as indiscriminate shelling of the towns of Western Tigray, which pushed many people to flee. But very quickly, within 2 weeks of the beginning of the conflict, the Amhara region appointed officials which took control of the area and began to implement a system of ethnically targeted restrictions, threats, intimidation that was clearly designed to make Tigrayans leave the area. In many of the violations we documented, the interviewees were telling us that perpetrators told them, "You don't belong here, go out or we will kill you. You have to move east of the Tekeze River, which marks the boundary between the area claimed by the Amhara region and the rest of Tigray." And so it's very clear that there was a deliberate policy of using violence and terror to remove Tigrayans from the area.
Yeah, how different, and I do want us to be a little bit comparative here to bring to perspective exactly what's happening. How different is what's happening in Tigray from what happened, say, in Zimbabwe with Kukurahundi, where Ndebele-speaking people were killed by a Shona-slanted government? How different is this from what happened in the Rwandan genocides with the Hutus and the Tutsis? How different is this from Hitler's genocide on the Jews? How different is this from Palestinians being killed in Israel?
So there is a difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide, and there are situations where the two overlap, but genocide means the destruction of a group. So it's a policy that's designed to bring about the destruction of part of or the entirety of a group. And so in genocide, the intent to destroy the group is a very important aspect of the definition. It's one that is often very difficult to prove. So in the case of Rwanda, it was a genocide. In the case of Western Tigray, we found that this was ethnic cleansing, which is focused on the forced displacement. But we haven't, this is based on the research that we've been able to do. And of course, we're calling for more investigation. We haven't ruled out the possibility of a genocide. And so we're calling on more investigations. Our organizations have found that ethnic cleansing was carried out in a number of other situations, including in Myanmar, where the Rohingya were the target of an ethnic cleansing campaign. And so this is not, ethnic cleansing is not specifically a matter of what is happening in Ethiopia or the African countries. It's happened in many places around the world.
I want to speak a little bit about what precipitated this conflict. What is the fundamental contention between Amhara people in the Amhara region versus Tigrayan people in the Tigray region? Is it just tribal conflict, or is there something more fundamental that's causing? Is it religious split? What actually is bringing about this split?
Well, this is the political origins of this conflict are complex. They have to do with the changes in the politics at the center in Ethiopia. The Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, was ruling the country for decades and was sidelined from the ruling coalition in 2019 when Abiy Ahmed became prime minister. And in the years that followed, we saw rising tensions between the TPLF and the government and Abiy Ahmed, and these tensions culminated in the conflict. Abiy Ahmed has built an alliance with the Amhara region. So the Amhara region, alongside the Eritrean military, supported Abiy Ahmed and the federal military in the initial in the conflict against the TPLF at the beginning of the war. So when it comes to Western Tigray, particularly, the area is the site of long-standing disputes over the identity and the boundaries of the area. It's claimed by the Amhara region as part of Amhara. It's claimed as by Tigrayans as part of Tigray. And so on the occasion of the conflict, as a result of the battlefield dynamics and the fact that the government and its allied forces were able to push the Tigrayans forces east at the beginning of the conflict, the Amhara region established control over the area.
Okay,
so this is a political issue.
Yeah, so it seems to me that it's a dispute about who has ownership of a region of land effectively, because the Amhara people lay claim to it, the Tigrayan people lay claim to it. What's so significant about this particular piece of region of land?
Well, it's an area that is very fertile, so there are a lot of economic interests at play. It's also from a strategic perspective, it's the area that connects Tigray to Sudan. And so I think that was part of the rationale at the beginning of the conflict, for which the government tried to cut this area off from access, cut the Tigrayan forces off from access to Sudan. But I just want to say that, our organizations, we are human rights organizations, and we don't take positions on the territorial dispute itself. This is something that is outside of our mandate. But regardless of the solution to the territorial dispute, the rights of people should be preserved.
Yeah.
People should be able to live in the area where they grew up, where they lived for decades. And any disputes around the administrative boundaries and the identity of a land should always be resolved with an eye to preserving the rights of various people living in these areas.
I want to take a quick break, but on the other side of the break, I want us to speak about what the possible solution looks like here, and why the international community has not been as vocal on, say, the Tigrayan war versus, say, Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine, and why is it that 5 million people are unable to access humanitarian aid, and what can be done to bring that sort of support to those people, so that people shouldn't have to die from hunger in the middle of a war, right? That's not something that even makes sense. But we're going to take a quick break. On the other side of this, we continue this conversation.
This week, today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
Here, there, and everywhere. SAFM 106.2 FM in Tohoyandou.
Oliver Dickson on SAFM.
And I'm in conversation with a consultant to Amnesty International, Jean-Baptiste Galopin. Jean, let's get back to the conversation around what the solution looks like. But let's start first with the immediate solution, and that's getting humanitarian aid to the people in Tigray. Why has humanitarian aid not been able to access them? Is there enough humanitarian aid? I read a figure to the tune of $1.8 billion having been donated in humanitarian aid and being raised globally in terms of that. That seems to be a fraction of what's being raised for the people of Ukraine, right? Let's talk about how do we get humanitarian aid to the 5 million people who are at risk of dying from hunger.
So that's the issue of humanitarian access has been central preoccupation of our organization since the beginning of the conflict. The authorities have imposed a de facto siege on the Tigray region, preventing humanitarian organizations from carrying out their work. the government has also revoked the authorizations of some organizations which were operating in the area, and that's had a devastating impact on the civilian populations in Tigray. When it comes to Western Tigray specifically, so a lot of this question of humanitarian access has to do with food, of course, but there are other humanitarian issues which are at play. One is the protection of civilians from abuses. So the forces that are currently in control of Western Tigray are these abusive forces which carried out ethnic cleansing. And we are very concerned about the fate and frankly, the survival of populations of Tigrayans who are still in the area. We believe there are thousands of Tigrayans who are held in makeshift or formal prisons where many people die of starvation because they are denied access to food, or dying because of lack of medical care, or because of torture and killings. And so our calls, when it comes to Western Tigray, focus on the protection of the civilians. So first, we call on the government to allow unfettered, unrestricted humanitarian access to Tigray, including Western Tigray. We call on the government to release the people who have been arbitrarily detained, and to tell the world about the whereabouts of people who have been detained since the beginning of the conflict and who have disappeared. We're also calling on the government to disarm and demobilize the irregular militias which are responsible for abuses in Tigray, but also to remove from their positions their officials of security forces and civilian officials which have been responsible, we believe are responsible for ethnic cleansing, pending an investigation. When it comes to like our international calls, we are calling for that any agreement between the warring parties include the deployment of a peacekeeping force led by the African Union with the mandate to protect civilians and the resources to do so. Because, the territorial dispute of Western Tigray is very complex. The conflict, the broader Tigray conflict is also a very challenging one to solve, but the survival of these civilians and these communities cannot be held hostage to this territorial and this political dispute. They have to be protected now, and that's an obligation of the parties of the conflict.
It's clear to me, Jean, that the government stands in the way of humanitarian aid accessing the people of Tigray. It's the government that is allowing for unfettered imprisonment and extrajudicial imprisonment of people who end up dying of lack of healthcare, lack of access to food, and that sort of stuff. If you're calling on the government to do any of this, right, and they haven't been doing any of this, what sort of measures should the world take? Should the African Union call for some special convention where there are special sanctions placed on the government of Ethiopia to get it to, cooperate to some of these calls?
So I just want to clarify one thing. When it comes to Western Tigray, we found that the primary perpetrators were the forces and the officials of the Amara region. But they've done so with the complicity of the Ethiopian military at times. The Ethiopian military had checkpoints where they prevented Tigrayans from fleeing into Sudan because, when Tigrayans fled into Sudan, they spoke to journalists and to human rights researchers. So the authorities developed extensive efforts to prevent people from fleeing. The federal military also, killed suspected members of the TPLF. They indiscriminately bombed the cities. They've detained large numbers of people. So they are complicit in what happened. And when it comes to your question about what the international community should do, we believe the African Union should really step up its game when it comes to Tigray. Just like the Security Council of the UN, the African Union has been largely inactive in the face of these crimes against humanity, and we are calling on the African Union Peace and Security Council to really put the situation in Tigray on its agenda and to discuss the possibility of, in the event of any agreement between the warring parties of a peacekeeping mission under its leadership.
It's quite ironic that the African Union is housed in Ethiopia, right? And yet still inactive to this matter. Why? And just a final question. Why has the African Union been slow off the mark or reluctant to do anything about this? Are they politically handicapped here?
Well, I don't really want to speculate on the reasons for that. I think, as you mentioned, the fact that the fact that the African Union is based in Ethiopia, I think has been one reason why there's been so much reluctance. I think there's been a denial of what's happening there. The government denied that this was a war for months before it had to change its discourse. And I think there's been a kind of wait and see attitude among not just African countries, but also many European countries. And so I think it's crucial that everyone understands how urgent the situation is. We cannot wait any longer to protect civilians.
Absolutely. Jean-Baptiste Galopin, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from France.
Thank you so
much. It is an honor to have you in our company. It's been an honor to be in your company. Let's have a listen at some of your voice notes. Let's go through some of your SMSs. Thank you so much for your engagement. Again, you can still engage us on Twitter. It is at SAFM Radio, or you can simply tweet me at Oliver_speaking.
Good evening. It's Anonymous here in Cape Town. I'd like to comment about the issue of the vaccine. I think the doctor should really leave us alone with this issue of vaccines. We survived when COVID was really dangerous, and now that the COVID is finished, we don't really need vaccines. Please, we are fine the way we are. Thank you.
Good evening, Oliver. It's Doomsy from Cape Town. The guest you had on vaccinations, the problem, you see, whenever they try to compare other vaccinations to COVID vaccination, they miss the point that COVID vaccines are totally different from the other vaccines. As such, you cannot... It's too premature or too early to legislate them the same way you legislate other vaccines, because with yellow fever, the issue is about preventing yellow fever from crossing the border. But we all know that COVID-19 vaccines do not prevent the viruses from crossing the border. So there is a huge difference between these type of vaccines. As such, they cannot.
Good evening, Oliver. It's Dabo here from Pretoria. I think with what's happening in Ethiopia, what we need to do as Africans is start making our own noise. We can't be expecting Europe to prioritize our problems when we don't prioritize them ourselves. So we have media houses here. We do have big media houses. Why don't we make those noise? Why doesn't the African Union have a joint sitting and discuss what's happening in Ethiopia? Why are we waiting for Europe? Because we're not important to them.
Oliver, it is true. It is true that the world is quiet regarding the situation in Ethiopia. But if you look at it, we need to realize whose fault is it? It's really our fault. We have this phrase of African solutions for African problems, but AU is sleeping on the job. NATO, the EU, the Ukrainian leaders, they are all kicking and screaming and making a lot of noise about what's happening in Russia or in Ukraine. But somehow on our side we are quiet. So it is really the fault of Africans themselves.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Lazarus from Emalatlen.
Absolutely. It really is the fault of African leaders going quiet on African issues. That for me is mind-boggling. It's been a pleasure and an honor being in your company. I'm back with you next week for another edition of This Week Today. Stay safe. If you're not vaccinated, go get vaccinated, and stay healthy. My name is Oliver Dickson. I'm out.
SABC News, independent and impartial.
Serial rapist sentenced to 8 life terms, and SABC adopts a report on Marco Penny. Good evening. Serial rapist Sizo Mutasele has been sentenced to 8 life terms and another 195 years in prison by the High Court in Pretoria. He was convicted of 15 counts of rape, 8 counts of robbery with aggravating circumstances and kidnapping. Mutasele was found guilty of raping 16 victims between 2017 and